Yesterday's Gemara. So we learned the Mishnah about if a person is putting his schach, but there's an empty space in between the wall and the schach. The schach maybe doesn't reach the wall, and the schach is a little further away from the wall. And the Mishnah says that the maximum space you have is up to 3 tfachim, up to 3 handbreadths. Once it reaches 3 handbreadths of empty space, then that wall is no longer connected to the schach. So the wall is separated from the schach, and you can't consider that sukkah to have that wall. And if you have it on 2 sides of the sukkah, you don't have the schach reaching the walls. So then that would be 2 walls are removed from your sukkah, and your sukkah can no longer be kosher. Your sukkah needs to have at least 2.5 walls. And if the schach is away from the walls, and as I mentioned yesterday, the practical case of this would be if you buy a smaller schach than your mat, than your sukkah, you could have a lot of problems. And if you don't spread out the mat properly on top of your sukkah, so it could be problematic. Or if you were cheap on buying the fronds and you didn't buy enough, and so there's a whole area that doesn't have schach that's together, and it creates a whole long line in between the wall and your schach, or even if it's in between your schach from the somewhere in the middle of your sukkah. So anyway, so empty space passels the sukkah at 3 handbreadths. That's the rule. Now, the Mishnah then talks about 3 cases afterwards that deal with the law of doifen akuma, the bent wall, where you have non-kosher schach on the sides and kosher schach in the middle of your sukkah. And what it seems that the Mishnah is doing is making a contrast between empty space and non-kosher schach. Empty space, the maximum is up to 3 handbreadths, and non-kosher schach on the side of the sukkah is up to 4 cubits. So you got a lot of extra options there. Now, why is that? What is the reason? Why would there be such a big difference? Both of them are not really kosher for schach. Empty space is, of course, not kosher. And schach puzzle, invalid schach, is not kosher. So why is it such a big difference? Why would that be? Why should there be such a huge difference? Anyone?
Well, didn't we learn that if you mix the kosher schach with the non-kosher schach, it somehow supersedes the kosher schach, supersedes the non-kosher schach, but you can't mix kosher schach with space. Again, there's no mixing.
So that's an interesting.
We had that.
Yeah, we did have
the tree that was still attached, and then we somehow you wove it in with your regular stuff.
Yeah. The shachavtan, that was the Hebrew, that was the word in the Gemara, that you mix them together, the shachavtan. But here it's not that case. That's the thing. Here we're talking about that you're not mixing the schach. There's a whole area up to 4 cubits. That's close to 6 feet. That's total non-kosher schach only. There's no kosher schach mixed in, and yet it's going to be a kosher sukkah.
But also the shade is in effect too, right?
And the shade is seemingly a problem. Seemingly that should be a problem. The fact, but obviously you're not going to sit under that area. But somehow the sukkah is a big sukkah, and so you have more shade than sunlight, or more shade of kosher schach. And we're going to accept it. We're going to consider that okay. That's not going to be a problem, the shade issue. And the big amount of non-kosher schach is not going to be a problem. So why is that? What's the reason? Why could you have such a large amount of non-kosher schach from the side? So the answer really is that this is a halacha Moshe Sinai. You don't have to have a reason now. This is a law given to Moses at Sinai. This is the rule. Daif and Akuma is a law called the bent wall. What Rashi's bothered with, he says, okay, you have a bent wall. So why can't we bend it also if there's empty space? So he says there's two ways of understanding Doif and Akuma. And here Rashi goes into the mechanics. What is the mechanism? What is the avenue that we're using to allow? How does it work? How does Doif and Akuma work? So this is two ways of understanding it. One way is that, and this is the way I've always explained it, and this is the way Rashi concludes that it has to be this way, that Doif and Akuma means that the wall continues where the non-kosher schach is. And the non-kosher schach that's on your sukkah is a part of the wall. So the wall bends. It's like an L-shaped wall. The wall goes up, and then the wall goes horizontal, and that is the non-kosher schach is really your wall. So your wall bent, and that is the schach, that's the non-kosher schach, that's part of your wall now. And that's the understanding of Doif and Akuma that the Torah allows us, Hashem allows us, laws of halacha, this halacha l'mashem Sinai law. Doif and Akuma allows us to consider the wall to continue moving, to continue as part of the schach that's on the roof, and it bends, and it continue, and it basically is the roof now is part of your wall. The other way of understanding Doif and Akuma is that the law, the special law that was given to Moses at Sinai, is that the wall that was 4 feet where it is now, it's 4 feet away from the kosher schach. It's up to a little less than 4 feet away from the 4 feet. It's up to 6 feet. It's close to 6 feet away from the kosher schach. That wall we bend and we move it inward towards the kosher schach. So it's not that the schach on top is being used as part of the wall. It's that we move the wall over. The Torah allows us to to consider it as if the wall is moved over. Not that the schach on top is part of the wall. The wall is moved over and it's bent to be next to the schach. Now, if you think about these two options, so Rashi says, you know why you can't do this rule of Doif and Akuma when you have empty space? It's because the first way that I explained it is the correct way. We need a wall to bend. If there's nothing there, there's no wall that you're bending. You're bending of the wall, there's nothing there. But if you're moving over the wall up to 6 feet, we consider it as if the wall is moved over and it's now right under the schach. Then who cares if there's empty space or not? We can move over the wall, whether there's space or whether there's non-kosher schach. If we're allowed to move over the wall, we should be allowed to move over the wall. So here, Rashi is very interesting. He goes into what the way, the whole mechanism of Doif and Akuma, how it works, and he proves that this must be the pshat, this must be the meaning of it, because otherwise, empty space should also be up to 4 cubits. You should be able to have the same amount of empty space if the other pshat is correct. Now, the interesting thing is it is brought down this other understanding of Doif and Akuma in maybe 1 or 2 of the Rishonim, but the way Rashi learns it seemingly is the simple understanding, and Rashi tries to prove that this is the meaning of Doif and Akuma. Again, so the conclusion, Rashi had 2 ways of understanding Doif and Akuma. One way was that we just bend the wall, meaning that the schach that's non-kosher on top is part of the wall, and the wall is bent. It's not only a vertical wall. It's a vertical and a horizontal. It's an L-shaped wall, and that's the simple understanding of Doif and Akuma. Rashi concludes that's the correct understanding. But the other way of understanding it, and it is brought in some Rishonim, they do bring this other way of understanding Doif and Akuma, and that means that the wall is just moved over, and it's bent over, but it's not part of the schach on top that's non-kosher. That schach that's non-kosher is not part of the wall. it's the wall of your sukkah. Instead of it being over here, we actually move over your wall and consider it closer to the schach, to the kosher schach. So Rashi holds that the difference between these two ways of understanding would be if you would be allowed to use empty space as doif and akuma. And because our Mishnah says you cannot, that you don't have 4 cubits of empty space, and it only says you get 3 tfachim, which basically is the law of Lavud. You don't have 4 cubits of empty space. So Rashi says this proves that the one way of understanding Doif and Akuma is correct and the other way is wrong. Now the other Rishonim, whoever learns this, that it's the wall is moved over, how do they answer Rashi's question? How would they answer this proof that Rashi has? Well, why do you only get 3 handbreadth, up to 3 handbreadths in empty space? If the wall is moved over, then who cares if there's empty space? Let it be up to 6 feet. Let it be up to 4 cubits. And we should be able to move over the wall and make it a kosher sukkah. Why do we care if there's empty space? Why is empty space such a different ruling, a different measurement than non-kosher schach? So how do they learn that? So the answer is that they learn that it's a halacha l'maisha misinai, that it only works with non-kosher schach. It doesn't work with empty space. So they agree with this halacha because it's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says it's halacha, but they say that that's part of the halacha l'maisha misinai. That's part of the law given to Moses, that this only works with non-kosher schach. It doesn't work with. It won't work with. It won't work with empty space. Okay.
Right.
Yes. Yes, Victor. Yeah.
What's that? Shorish. In other words, all these halachot that are the Moshe Sinai. Is
Right.
there like a list somewhere? Is this part of the oral tradition? The Gemara is where. In other words,
Well,
there's
we had
something that
a
handed
we had a
down from
brisa.
generation to generation, or
Yeah. Well, there are numerous things, and it often does. The Gemara sometimes like combines them. Like the Gemara in Tainus had a few things that it said. Nisach Hamaya, it said like 3 things. Nisach Hamayim and 2 other things are halach l'maisha mesina. Our Gemara also combined a few things. It says mechitzin and something sukkah mechitzin. It said like a few things are halach l'maisha mesina. So like it does sometimes like combine a few things. It was in where was it in the? I think right in the beginning. In the beginning over there. It says mechitzin. I have to remember now. Where did it say mechitzin is a halacha? Oh, I remember. Now it was the when we were trying to get to the measurement of 10 tefachim. 10 tefachim. How do we know? We tried to bring all these different proofs, and then the Gemara said that Hilchas Gemiri law. It's a halacha l'maisha Sinai. Damer Rechia Barashi Abarav Shiurin Chatzitzin or Mechitzin. Shiurin Chatzitzin Mechitzin is halacha l'maisha Sinai. So it like combines them. It tells you, we got three things here that are halacha l'maisha Sinai. But then in Tainus we had a similar thing where it mentioned about the Nisach Hamayim is halacha l'maisha Sinai. I think it mentioned like 1 or 2 other things there as well in the beginning of Tainus, and probably pull it up here. I don't have a Gemara Tainus in front of me, but whatever, maybe I'll take a look after. So, but I don't know if there's a place where you can get the whole list of all the halacha l'maisha misinais. I guess
so more like the Gemara brings it up as needed when in needed, that apparent subject.
Right, right. The topic.
That's how it's done.
Yeah, based on the topic. Yeah. Anyway, okay, so so this is the 2 ways of learning Doif and Akuma. I did want to just mention that one of the commentaries brings down what would the difference be between these 2 ways of learning. If Doif and Akuma is moving the wall over, or Doif and Akuma means the wall is bent. So there's an interesting nafka mina, difference between the 2. He says that what happens if you steal schach, cut non-kosher stuff? So you have non-kosher schach that's stolen. Now, according to halacha, you're not allowed to use a wall. Even for your walls, you can't use stolen items. So if there's a stolen piece of wood that's taking up a substantial space on your sukkah of the wall, that would be a problem because it's stolen and would invalidate your sukkah. Now, he says, what would happen if you have non-kosher schach on the top of your sukkah, the edge, up to 4 feet. Now, if you learn that doifen akuma means that we consider the non-kosher schach as up to 4 cubits, excuse me, up to 4 cubits is you're allowed to have non-kosher schach, right? But what happens if you have not only it's non-kosher schach, but it's also stolen? So now the thing is, if doifen akuma means that we consider that part of the wall, so then guess what? Now you have a non-kosher sukkah, not because of the non-kosher schach element of it. That would be fine because doifen akuma, so bent wall. But now your wall is stolen. It's a stolen wall. You have a big chunk that's stolen. It makes the sukkah non-kosher. However, if the law of doifen akuma is that we move over the wall to the schach, and that's what doifen akuma means, that not that we're using the non-kosher schach that's on top as if it's part of the wall. No, we're just moving the wall over to the kosher schach. Then what happens now? The stolen piece of non-kosher schach that's on your roof is no one's business. My sukkah is a kosher sukkah. I have a wall that's kosher, it wasn't stolen. My kosher schach wasn't stolen. My wall is moved over to the kosher schach, and I have somewhere on the side there happens to be some stolen material, but it's not part of my making my sukkah. It's not part of my sukkah, and therefore this could be a difference between the two ways of learning a doifen akuma. Just a little thought. Okay, so getting back to the Gemara that we did yesterday. So we have after the Mishnah mentions the law about empty space, then it mentions the law of non-kosher schach. So we got empty
Rabbi.
space. Yeah. Yes, David.
Yeah, there's a program. I mentioned this before to you, I think. There's a program put out by Microsoft. It's just called Copilot, which answers all these different questions. So I just looked up halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and I said halacha l'Moshe Sinai. How many are there? And it says Rambam lists 31 halachas l'Moshe Sinai in his introduction to the Mishnah. So there's
okay.
Yeah, so there's 31, and let me see if it gives a list.
That's artificial intelligence. I'd be very, very careful. About facts, because they all if they don't have a number handy, they just make one up.
No, but so it refers you each time it says something. It tells you the source. So I click the source, and there's an article written. It's called 31 halachas of the Moshe Sinai according to Rambam. And
where's the article?
Okay. Listen, it sounds good. We'll have to take a look in the Perush HaMashnayos.
It's called outorah.org.
Oh, that's good.
Okay,
that sounds reliable. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, David, for looking it up. I also looked up the Gemara Tainus, where it says about halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It says Eser netiyos, arava, and nisoch hamayim are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Those were the three things. So there it also like joins a few things together. Eser netiyos is regarding Shemitah. Arava was regarding the minhag that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai about the Arava on the Shana Rabbah, and Nisach Hamayim.
The colors of the bottom on tefillin.
So that's another thing. Not the color of the Retzuos. The Retzuos. Our halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Yeah, that's another thing. That's correct. Thank you, Isaac. Yeah. Anyway, we'll have to take a look in the thank you, David, for bringing that up. That it's in the Perush HaMashnayos Rambam. Now we know a location that gathered all the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay.
I hope the computers have gotten better since the original days. I remember there was a story there when they asked a rabbi how many times it says in the Chumash Moshe, and the
He
computer had 2 extra times
Oh,
than the rabbi, and the
right.
computer they found out was using Miyot Miseh and Mashe Yado, and added those
Right.
in by mistake. So the rabbi knew better than the computer. So I
Right.
agree with you. We should be careful, and you know,
Right. Good point. Good point.
better
Yes.
to trust the rabbis than the computers.
Good point.
I
Good
used
point.
to
Okay.
give classes in how to do legal research using a computer. Because I was from the very last generation where we actually went to the library and touched books. So they thought I would be, competent to teach the difference. Good luck.
Okay. So so we're talking about Doit and Akuma, and the Mishnah gave 3 examples, and the Gemara goes through why do we need all 3? And the Gemara said because Bayis Shenifchas, the case where the house has a hole inside the roof, so these are considered the walls that you're going to use for your sukkah were meant as walls. So being that they're meant as walls, so that makes sense that we should be able to use them for a sukkah. But the other case, really, the walls were meant not for they were not meant for your sukkah, they were meant for the inside of the house. In the case of the portico, the walls of the are really walls for the house. Happens to be you want to use it for your sukkah. So not necessarily can we say there the law of Doif and Akuma that wall will be able to be used as a doifen, as a wall for doifen akuma to use for the opposite direction, and the Mishnah tells us that even there it's also usable for doifen akuma. I should just mention while we're talking about this case, what happens if you have a wall and 2 people are building their sukkahs using this wall, and each of them have like some type of overhang, so they're relying on doif and akuma. Is there a problem? So they're basically back to back. One person has their sukkah on this side of the wall, the other person has their sukkah on the other side of the wall, and they're relying on doif and akuma that the wall extends and bends over and is going to, they want to both rely on that same law. Can you do that? Can you both rely on Doif and Akuma and say the wall bends this way and the wall bends that way? Or is there a problem with making a wall bend in 2 different directions? So it seems like it's no problem. It's an interesting thought based on this case, and talking about the mechanism of how Doif and Akuma works. But seemingly, it shouldn't be a problem to split the wall in half, I guess, and use half for this way, half that way, or have a wall that looks like a T, I guess. I mean, I guess it could be, shouldn't be a problem. There are discussions about using 2 halacha l'maisha misinais together, and we saw it in the Gemara about using a loved. Can you do loved twice? We saw that yesterday and the day before, and Friday, about using loved twice. Here it does become a discussion actually on our Mishnah, where let's say a person's walls are not going all the way up to the schach, so you have to rely on the law of good asik, where we extend the wall all the way up to the schach. Now, let's say the schach is not right there on top where the walls are. It's not up. It's really a few inches in. So it's less than 3 handbreadths. So can we say lavud that will extend from the wall? That's a imaginary wall called a good asik wall. It's an imaginary wall. Can we use that imaginary wall to say lavud and attach the and consider that the schach goes to the wall, and consider the good asik and lavud, and altogether it would be a kosher sukkah. And it seems like it's some machlokes about that. There seems to be an argument in halacha if you can do that, you can rely on these two halacha, two rules of good asik and the law of lavud. Okay, so getting back to our Gemara, so our Gemara then said, well, what about the third case? What is the third case adding? So the Gemara says, well, the first two cases are talking about kosher schach. The third case is non-kosher schach. The first two cases are kosher schach, meaning they're not kosher to use, but the actual material is kosher material because it's boards that are roof. The roof is a board. The boards. So you could you theoretically it has in essence it's kosher. And so there we could say, well, we can make it part of the sukkah and no problem. Doifen akuma. But here it's totally not kosher, so maybe we can't really connect it to the sukkah and use it. And so even so, the Mishnah tells us that it's okay, and that was the case in the Mishnah where it says, "Davar she'ein masachichin bo." You use something that you not supposed to use for schach. It's not kosher for schach. Even there, it's going to be acceptable. We can still use the law of doifen akuma. And that's basically the explanation of the three cases of the Mishnah. Three cases of the Mishnah explaining the three cases of the Mishnah. So now the Gemara now tells us that Rabbah found the Rabbanon of Bei Rav. Now, Bei Rav doesn't always mean Rav's beis medrash. Sometimes Bei Rav could mean the beis medrash of the rabbi. But here, seemingly, it does actually refer to Bei Rav, the actual beis medrash of Rav. And maybe we'll see later why that is, that it means it literally. These are the students over there. And the rabbis of the beis medrash of Rav, of the scholars in his yeshiva, or the students of the yeshiva. So they were sitting and saying that avir, empty space, it invalidates your sukkah when there's 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths. Now, just to make this very clear, what our Mishnah and Gemara are talking about when you talk about these empty spaces, so non-kosher schach, the Mishnah mentioned empty space and non-kosher schach on the side, but our Gemara is going to be talking about non-kosher schach in the middle of the sukkah and empty space in the middle of the sukkah. What are we referring to? So the simple case that we are referring to is where you have a 3-wall sukkah, and the middle wall has a empty space area that extends from the middle back wall all the way to the entrance. And what's going to happen if we have too much empty space or too much non-kosher schach there, what's going to happen is it is going to break your sukkah in half. That's the situation that we're dealing with. Why do I say that? Because if we were dealing with a 3-walled sukkah and the non-kosher schach goes from one wall to the other wall, not to the entrance, it means it goes from one of the side walls to the other side wall, then there's a lot of potential that your sukkah is still going to be kosher, because as long as you have 3 walls with kosher schach of 7 handbreadths of space by 7 handbreadths of space, your sukkah, the inner part of your sukkah, is kosher. But here we're ruining your entire sukkah. Why? Because your sukkah is being broken in half, and all you have are 2 walls with some schach. Now, 2 walls with schach is not a kosher sukkah. What do you mean? I have 3 walls. Yeah, you have 3 walls, but the empty space in the schach, or the non-kosher schach in the schach, breaks your sukkah in half and divides it and separates it and makes it considered to be a non-kosher sukkah. So now let's go back to the Gemara. The Gemara had mentioned that Rabbah said that he came to the beis medrash of Rav, and he heard the rabbis there talking, and they were saying that when you have empty space, 3 handbreadths is the max, is too much. You're ready. Your sukkah is no longer kosher. It passels it it invalidates it at the size of 3 handbreadths. Now, what about schach puzzle? Invalid schach, that invalidates it at 4 handbreadths. And Rabbah, who was the rabbi who came there, he was a little surprised. And he said, where do you know this from? How do you know empty space invalidates a sukkah at 3 handbreadths? Anyone know a source for that? Empty space invalidates a sukkah when you have 3 handbreadths.
In the schach or in a wall?
In the schach.
The schach.
Well, it's actually the first line on our page 17a. If you separated the schach from the walls 3 handbreadths, it's invalid. So that would be the source that empty space, airspace of 3 handbreadths invalidates a sukkah. So Rabbah asked these young rabbis.
Well, what are you using doifen akuma to fill in with? I'm saying that's where you would like to find some reason to extend the wall out to the schach.
We'd like to be able to. We can't because it's empty
you're
space.
right. No, I'm saying there's 2 things. It seems to me there's the 2 most important criteria with schach is what it is and where it is. And there's 2 separate questions because you have different questions with the what's and the where. That's all.
Right. But our Mishnah adds another thing, that what happens if you have I guess it's what it is, right? Our Mishnah talks about the what it is, right. It's having non-kosher stuff. So what Rabbah is asking these young rabbis is, so how do you know about this law of empty space? It says our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says if you separate the schach from the walls, you got 3 handbreadths. It's already invalid. You see empty space. It invalidates the sukkah 3 handbreadths. So he says. Oh, you're learning it from our Mishnah? So if so, when you have non-kosher schach, what does our Mishnah say about that? When it's not empty space, what does our Mishnah say about non-kosher schach? How much do you have then? For what?
For
Welcome.
Our Mishnah doesn't say 4 tefachim. What does our Mishnah say?
For amos.
4 cubits, 4 amos. Our Mishnah, if you're relying on our Mishnah about the empty space, Rabbah says, what does our Mishnah say about non-kosher schach? It says you have up to 4 cubits. He says, so why are you people talking about 4 handbreadths like Isaac thought? Why are you people saying this thing about 4 handbreadths? You're using our Mishnah about the empty space. Use the Mishnah also for you have 4 cubits. Right? That's what. So they answered him, no. Rav and Shmuel both say that it's all about doifen akuma. This has to do with doifen akuma. This is the Mishnah talks about non-kosher schach. It's a special type of situation here. Why? Because we're dealing with this on the side by the wall. It falls into another category called doifen akuma. If it's 4 cubits, you can't say doifen akuma. If it's less than 4 cubits, you can say doifen akuma. Basically, we can permit this non-kosher schach, a very large amount of it, because we can use the rule, the halacha, l'meisha misinai, this law given to Moses, it's sign called doifen akuma, that the wall is bent, and we can consider it part of the wall, and we can allow such a sukkah to be used. So here, the Mishnah, what they're telling Rabbah is that the Mishnah doesn't really deal with non-kosher schach in the middle. It only deals with non-kosher schach on the side. And the reason why is because the Mishnah is dealing with the law of doifen akuma. It's not dealing with the law of non-kosher schach in the middle.
Yeah, there's no doifen akuma that's going to help you with the hole in the middle.
Right. Exactly.
But
So
you could redistribute the stock you have. How? That's why I don't understand why it doesn't say tikkun, because you could redistribute the schach that you have, so that it would be
Right.
okay. Especially
Right.
in that case of the split space. As
So
long as we're
maybe-
being liberal about the ages.
Right. So the thing is that our Mishnah doesn't really deal with schach in the middle that you would redistribute. Our Mishnah is really just dealing with on the side. So if it's on the side, you don't need to redistribute
tell
it
you-
if as long as it's less than 4 hand breaths, you know.
You also have a problem with schach like bamboo that you can't just spread around. It has a certain length to it that it can only go that way, and the width is going to be, you can't just, it's not like leaves that you can bend over and move and whatever. You have whatever.
Could be. Okay. Anyway, so we're going to now start here in the Gemara. And let me tell you where we're starting. Va'amino lahu. Va'amino lahu is maybe 12 lines up from the bottom of the page on 17a. 17a, 12 lines up from the bottom. Va'amino lahu ano. And I, Rabbah, said to them that it's not so simple to learn that way. He says, Ma ilus ika schach puzzle, pachos me'arba. What would happen if you have invalid schach, but it's less than 4? Invalid schach, less than 4, right, is kosher. Doesn't separate your sukkah in two. But what happens right next to it is also empty space. Va'avir pachos mishloisha. You also have some empty space right next to it. So you got non-kosher schach, and you got empty space. And the empty space is not the measurement of 3. It's less than 3 hand breaths. So you don't have enough empty space on its own to ruin it. You don't have enough non-kosher schach to ruin your sukkah, but they're both next to each other. So he says, what would the law be in such a case? Does it divide your sukkah in two in that scenario? Again, you've got just less than the amount of non-kosher schach, just less than the amount of empty space, and they're both next to each other. Does they ruin your sukkah? No, kshera. It's going to be kosher, it says. And so he says, Malya b'shipudin. So what would happen if you filled it up with
skewers,
invalid schach, skewers or spits that are metal, right? Or things that are invalid for it's a davar shemakabel tuma. So it's something that's invalid for schach. What would happen if you filled up that empty space with these skewers? So let's think. Well, you had just less than the 4 hand breaths, and now you're filling it up with these skewers. Now it's going to be more than 4 hand breaths. So he says, what would the law be? Psula, it's going to be invalid. But why should that be? Empty space is more strict than non-kosher schach. Empty space, you only get 3 hand breaths. Schach is much less strict, as you have up to 4 hand breaths. And here, what happens? There's empty space, it's kosher. But if you put in the non-kosher schach, you ruin it? How could that be? My psula, lo yehei avir ha-poisel b'shloisha kischach puzzle. Shouldn't the avir, the empty space, be just as, which is supposed to be more strict? Shouldn't it at least be as strict as the
non-kosher schach?
As the non-kosher schach, and it should ruin it even if you don't put the skewers there? Kischach puzzle ha-poisel bi'arba. Shouldn't the non-kosher schach shouldn't it be the same? Shouldn't the empty space be the same as the non-kosher schach, and it should be poisel, a poisel bi'arba, which according to you invalidates the sukkah at 4. Now, this is Rabba's question, that if you're considering schach puzzle, that invalid schach puzzles a sukkah at 4 handbreadths, we have a problem with how you deal with a case where you have non-kosher schach and you have empty space next to each other, and it turns out that your law seems to be a little warped. It seems to be messed up. Doesn't seem to flow. And basically what Rabbah seems to imply is that really the halacha should be, like our Mishnah says, not 4 handbreadths, but 4 cubits should be the size of non-kosher schach. That's what Rabbah wants to hold. Now, the students were not so easy to give in to Rabbah. And va'amru li, and they said to me, Ihachi, if so, what do you gain by your opinion? You still have a problem. L'didach nami da'amrit schach posel bi'arba amais. According to you, an invalid schach invalidates the sukkah when it has 4 cubits. Okay, you got a whole different measurement, but still, you're going to still have the same problem. Ma ilu ika schach puzzle. What would happen if you have invalid schach less than the 4 cubits? So you have a different measurement, but fine. Let's say you have your measurement, but it's a little less than that. So you're okay. You're still kosher. And ba'avir pachas mishleisha, and then your measurement of empty space is less than 3, next to the up to 4 cubits of non-kosher schach, and up to 3 cubits, 3 handbreadths of empty space right next to it. What happens then? Is that sukkah, does it become invalidated? So, what would the halacha be? So, sheira, of course, it's kosher, because each of these problems are not the full measure that they need to be to ruin things. The amount of empty space is 3 handbreadths. You have less than that. The amount of non-kosher schach, according to Rabbah, is 4 cubits. You have less than that. So together, they're put together. Okay, so they're right next to each other, but it doesn't invalid kosher. Now, what's going to happen? Mal yobish budid. What happens now if you fill the empty space with skewers? What's going to be the din according to you? You're going to have the same problem. Now you're going to ruin it, right? Because now it's more than the amount of non-kosher stuff. Now you've just overdid it. Psula, it's going to be puzzle. How could that be? Shouldn't the empty space that's much more strict, that invalidates a 3, shouldn't it at least be as bad as the invalid? It should at least be as bad as the kischach puzzle, as the invalid schach hapoisel bi'arba amos. Shouldn't it at least be as bad? So, in other words, according to you, the same thing should basically be just as bad, that you're going to have 4 cubits of just less than 4 cubits, and next to it is empty space. It also should be invalid, because what happens if you fill it up with skewers? You're going to make it a little more than 4 cubits, and it's going to be invalid. And now it's empty space. It shouldn't be invalid. Empty space is worse than the skewers, and that's what we know. It's empty space is much worse, because the 3 versus 4 cubits, 3 handbreadths versus 4 cubits. Of course, empty space should be much worse.